Hello and welcome to Crossing Channels. I'm Rory Cellan-Jones. Should there be a compulsory retirement age for society's leaders? That's the subject of the latest in our podcast collaboration between Cambridge University's Bennett Institute for Public Policy and the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. And for the first time, we're taking to the stage and recording this episode in front of a live audience at the Institut Français in London. How fitting for this joint enterprise between two of the UK and France's great universities. As ever, we're exploring a complex question. Does age determine leaders' effectiveness? What are the social and economic consequences of a compulsory retirement age? And are there alternative policies or strategies that strike a balance between regular turnover of leaders while preserving expertise and knowledge? To explore these issues, we've got a great panel today. We have Diane Coyle from the Bennett Institute. Diane, start us off. What does your research focus on?
I'm an economist, and I have been studying the digital economy and productivity for about as long as there has been a digital economy, since the mid-1990s. I can't help noticing that the average age of those of us on the panel is rather higher than the average age of our audience this evening.
I should say also, in the interests of full disclosure, I've been married to Diane for 34 years, so I should know what her research interests are by now. And joining us from the IAST, we have Ruth Mace and Paul Seabright. Ruth, what does your research focus on?
I'm an evolutionary anthropologist, so I'm particularly interested in the evolution of behaviour and also the evolution of culture. So that's very broad, I know. So I might be taking a slightly longer view than some of the other panel members on some of the questions.
Yeah, we'll have a long-term and short-term view. We'll have a whole range of views here. Paul, what are your main research interests?
Well, I'm so close to retirement that I can barely remember anymore. But last time I checked, I worked at the intersection between behavioral economics and the economics of institutions. So basically where our prehistoric brain meets the modern world.
Great. What a range of talents we've got here. So let's start with an awfully big question. What, after all, constitutes a good leader? And does their age have a major impact on their ability to lead effectively? Diane, kick us off.
Well, as you say, big question, and there are clearly lots of attributes that you need to be a good leader, and experience is one of them. So experience is probably correlated with age, but on the other hand, there are plenty of elderly politicians who've done nothing else all their life and don't seem to have any other experiences. So I'm going to go for what makes a good leader is actually the breadth of attributes. It's not just technical skill, it's not just age and experience, good judgment, a range of people around you. So a portfolio of attributes of which age is only one thing.
Yeah, and we're obviously talking about leaders, not just political leaders, but leaders of organisations, leaders of businesses too. And we'll get on to later on to whether there are different factors in different contexts. Ruth, what's your thinking on what constitutes a good leader?
I think different groups of people are going to choose their own leaders. So if you're talking about institutions, then experience might count for a lot. But if you're thinking about the younger generation, I mean, they might, list people like Greta Thunberg and others as their leaders. And so they're looking at a completely different set of criteria like moral integrity or something that represents what they care about, which might be completely different to what the older generation cares about. So hopefully different groups will choose their own leaders.
And does their age have a... I mean, think back over your experience, I suppose. We'll all have worked for leaders of one kind or another. Have you found that age is valuable, experience is valuable, as opposed to a fresh perspective?
I think it can be very valuable, and I think sometimes older leaders are less inclined to get into arguments about things, which is one of the things that I find quite useful in older leaders. Well, but that might not always be true. I'm sure everyone's got horrible examples that completely counter that. But
they know all the tricks about how things work, don't they? So they know how to make the system work. They've got that kind of experience. So I guess it depends on whether you want somebody who knows how to operate things or not stir up trouble, as Ruth is saying, or do you want somebody who's going to have lots of fresh ideas? So the context is going to matter as well.
Paul, I think you're working on a project in this field generally, aren't you?
Yes, I've been working with Guido Friebel at the University of Frankfurt and thinking recently about two kinds of talent that we look for in other people. And there are talents you might call skill, and there are talents you might call judgment. And the big difference between them is that to tell whether somebody else has got skill, I don't have to have it myself. So I can tell whether somebody's a good juggler without being able to juggle. But to tell whether somebody's got good judgment, I actually need good judgment myself. If I want to know whether President Biden's approach to China is really a good thing for the world, I have to be able to go through pretty much the same steps of thinking about the issues that he does. And that's a problem because leaders are typically selected by people who are not leaders. We tend to select them for skill, for things like being able to give a good speech, which we can all tell even if we can't give a good speech ourselves. But we increasingly need them to exercise judgment about some of the big questions of the world. And I think that is a problem. And we'll talk later about whether judgment might be something that is particularly vulnerable to the pressures of old age.
And what's your personal experience of leadership, both your own and people you've been led by? Have you, over the years, changed your view of what makes a good leader and whether their age is a factor in that?
Yes, I think one of the reasons why leaders tend to be older than the rest of society is exactly the fact that it takes time for the rest of the people they work with to figure out whether they have judgment or not. You can tell skill pretty quickly and in somebody pretty young, but usually you have to observe a leader over many years to see whether they exercise judgment effectively. And that's a problem because in some sense you only become confident about the fact that they were good leaders at precisely the time when they may be ceasing to be as good as they used to be.
Let's see if we've got any facts here. Are leaders getting older on average? And if so, is that a problem?
They are. So with work I've been doing with Guido, we've been looking at the age of chief executives of large European and American companies, and we have data going about 30 years, and they've been getting older by about a year per decade. Over that period. Now, that may not seem by
that's
a great deal,
somehow counterintuitive. We think, particularly in the tech era, that leaders of tech companies tend to be thrusting young, technology-focused people.
Yeah, but there have always been young leaders, and they're not typical statistically of the rest of the population. And of course, the worrying thing is that if you project it forward many more decades, as we've seen in political leaders, so we have data on the governors of US states going back to the Civil War, and they've been getting older at slightly slower rate. They age by about a year every 17 years. But from the Civil War to today, the US governor's mean age has gone from being in the late 40s to being in the early 60s. And that's a big change.
Rory's supposed to ask the questions, but I want to ask something. What's the change in the average age of the population that they are leading over that same period?
Yeah, I was going to say the same. You would expect, when life expectancy has grown, that we would be looking for older people to lead.
Oh, I'm not saying it's surprising, but I'm saying that if you want to think about how the things you look for in a leader change with age, you want to take into account some basic demographics. And those are changing, and those are changing in ways we might be concerned about. I'll talk later about whether I think we should, but the changes are happening, and they may not be surprising, but we should not pretend they're not happening.
Diane, I mean, many countries only allow those above a certain age, I don't know, 21, 25 or 35, to actually run for office. If there are minimum age requirements for political leadership roles, why is there such reluctance to implement compulsory retirement ages for leaders?
It's a good question, and the rationale for having a minimum age is this supposition that somebody who's going to be in a position of responsibility needs to have certain skills, certain experience, a certain amount of judgment. So that's the rationale for the minimum. But you might say, as you're implying with the question, that there should be some criteria around the maximum as well. I think the challenge is that people age differently and their capabilities deteriorate differently. And actually there's a lot of value in having the experience that comes with older leaders. So I wonder if the solution is to think about testing them in some way, or having mechanisms to oust them not at a particular age, but if there are certain things that they obviously cannot do. I mean, being slightly frivolous, one could say that a minister ought to be able to pass the citizenship test that they're setting for other people.
Yeah, if we started making those kind of rules, everybody would be out.
But can we think of tests? Can we think criteria? I suppose at both ends, perhaps it shouldn't be about calendar ages, but about some way of testing people's fitness for the role.
Ruth, what's your take on this?
I'm just going to tell you about a paper that I read quite recently looking at cultural change, and they were testing the difference between whether cultural norms change because cohorts die out or whether we are influenced by a change in the air. So is the whole population changing its view about something, or do we have to wait for generations to die out for anything to change? And overwhelmingly, it's the latter. So they showed very, very clearly that older cohorts are pretty set in their ways, and younger cohorts, have established different norms. And therefore, if we're talking about political leadership, I think there is actually a real problem here in that the older generation is simply not representing the younger generation. And we also don't want the younger generation to lead because they are simply not representing us. And they looked at all kinds of ideas. There was actually one major outlier, which was attitudes to gay rights and homosexuality. That's one of the things that seems to have undergone not just a generational change, but it's affected all generations. But that really was an outlier. And most other behaviours that they looked at in this paper, it was really quite frightening how much of a change in social norms was to do with actual cohorts moving on. So if you think about it like that, then it's not even about competence. If it's about representation, then we're going to have trouble. And also, no one's really mentioned power asymmetries either, which I think, because we've been talking about competence, but these leaders might be successfully hanging on to positions of authority, not because they're competent, but because they're powerful. And that's the other problem we've got with it all.
Paul, isn't there a different dynamic when it comes to politicians than to, say, business leaders? Politicians are looking at people who vote, and the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. So therefore, perhaps a grey hair more valuable in politics than in business, where you're more inclined to want to perhaps appeal to a younger demographic to show yourself to be a young, vigorous company.
Well, I think that's a rather optimistic view of the situation if you think that the reason why older leaders hang on longer, as it were, in politics than in business. I'm not sure it's true, but if it's true, if you're right that that's the reason, I think that would be broadly encouraging, but I'm not sure it is. I think it's because it's much easier for leaders in politics who are much further away from the people who put them there to be checked by the people who put them there. The information that the citizen has about his or her leaders is much sketchier, much more superficial, much more manipulated by the media than the information that people working in a company have about their CEO. And so I think that it's sadly quite likely that the ability of older leaders in politics to hang on for longer has to do with the fact that they're more entrenched rather than necessarily because they're more suitable.
Is it true that it's more sort of random how older politicians are chosen? I mean, the democratic process involves far more people than, say, are involved in choosing a chief executive or choosing who runs a university. There tend to be elites involved in that rather than the masses.
Well, the masses do something, but in fact, we were talking about Rory Stewart, the British politician, just when we were in the room before coming here. And in his memoirs, he says that he was very frustrated at one point because he felt that he was being valued for the things that he did, like being able to give good speeches at the dispatch box and remember a number of important statistics when questioned by journalists, but not for the things that he thought were important, like having a good strategic vision for the departments he was managing. Now, if a politician like that is admitting that what he's selected for, what he's rewarded for, are qualities that are not the ones that are most important for doing the job, then I think we ought to take that seriously.
Diane, let's be positive about older leaders in politics, business or academia. specific qualities or skills improve with age? Do most things improve with age? I mean, we all value experience.
Well, there's a distribution among older people. I must say, Ruth is making me rethink what I think about this. But as an older leader, I'm going to try to make the positive case. It is really experience, is it? So I don't think you can argue that skills improve with age. If anything, they're going to deteriorate, and particularly in
well, at a certain level. I mean, presumably your skills improve for the first 10 years, and then start going downhill.
And it depends what the area, what the domain is, because in a technical subject in the academic world, your skills can actually deteriorate very quickly. And that's why we like to have lots of young researchers alongside us, because they've got those technical skills. So you're really then talking about the experience and the judgment. There's this phrase in Aristotle that, as far as I understand it, is practical wisdom. As far as I understand it, means it's a combination of the experience of having seen a lot of things and knowing how to react to them, as well as inherent judgment. And I guess that's the kind of thing that is correlated with age. So you can't be sure that an older leader is going to have it, but it's a little bit more likely than somebody who's not had that same range of experiences and problems thrown at them that they've had to react to. So that I guess, is the positive case.
Ruth, what's your take on that?
I think most things get bad
Quite
rapidly. I mean, just going back to my evolution of life history, I mean, once if you take an evolutionary view of aging, once you've raised your children, natural selection is not acting very fast on any aspect of your being, because to put it crudely, your genes have passed on into the next generation, and beyond the age where you're having any more children, natural selection is not repairing your DNA, and you age, and this is what happens, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And we're quite good at getting rid of infectious disease and things like that, which is why our life expectancy has gone zooming up, but we're not very good at tackling, the problems of aging, because that's actually a much more difficult thing for natural selection to get a grip with. So I think all of our sort of mental and physical capacities, as we all know, start to suffer a little bit. So I think.
But don't you think there's something in having seen something a bit like this once before, so you've got an idea about
no,
how
I'm
to
not.
react
I'm
to
not.
it?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm not denying that there are also useful skills that you are accumulating, and one of those might be power. So you can keep yourself in a position of authority because you have accumulated a lot of power. But I have to say I'm a little bit pessimistic about the benefits of having very elderly leaders, which has obviously been brought into sharp focus with what's going on in the American elections. But I actually think that you can compensate for some of it, but you can't compensate for all of it.
Paul, I mean, I suppose there's a difference, isn't there, between somebody who comes to a position of power and leadership later in life and does it for 5-10 years, and somebody who comes much earlier and just hangs on and on and on.
Yes, absolutely. But what worries me actually is not whether on average older leaders are better or worse. I mean, I'm completely with the rest of the panel on the many qualities that older leaders have. What I'm more worried about is what happens in a crisis and how easy it is to deal with a crisis. And I'm struck by the fact that in dealing with dementia, for example, which I've had to deal with in my own family and which is something that's going to hit the world in a much bigger way in the next decades to come, and will start to trouble our leaders in future decades to a much greater degree than it has up to now. When you deal with dementia, one of the things you worry about is not that the person whom you love is forgetting names and occasionally wandering out. It's that actually they lose judgment. So they may or may not have deteriorating memory, but the real thing you're scared with when somebody close to you has dementia is that they'll sign away their life savings to a plausible stranger who calls them up. And it's the fact that in some sense judgment goes before skill visibly goes that really scares me in the case of elderly leaders. So I can quite believe that the average leaders might be getting better and better for quite a long period of time, but the rogue leaders whose prefrontal cortex has gone may be very much more difficult to get rid of. And that's, for me, is the nightmare.
But isn't it the case that in today's much more transparent era, we become aware of their failings very quickly. You know, there's a clip of, you know, President Biden falling down some steps out there within 10 seconds. Whereas, you know, Churchill, possibly Harold Wilson, two eminent British prime ministers, were obviously failing in their later stages, but that was kept from the public.
No, you're exactly right. But in some sense, the example you've given of President Biden only reinforces the point I want to make. We can all tell whether he's as skillful in getting down steps as he used to be. But if his skill at getting down the steps starts to go, that doesn't have world-shattering consequences. If his judgment about how to deal with potential aggression in Eastern Europe, in the Asia-Pacific and so on, if that has completely gone, and if the equivalent of somebody asking him to sign away his life savings is getting a broad smile from him, then that really does have world-shattering consequences. So I think that the fact that we appear to know more is biasing us, because the things we do know more about are things like whether somebody can get down steps.
You're thinking also about democratically elected leaders, and of course there's an awful lot of the world doesn't have democratically elected leaders, and they have basically a lot of gangster politics, which, and you know, we're almost going the same way. And these people can't retire because, you know,
retirement means death.
Exactly. If you've killed a lot of people on the way up, you're not going to live very long on the way down, and therefore you're not ever going to give up, and you're going to do everything in your power to get rid of any rules that might have forced you to retire. And I'm sure some of you know more about this than me. Wasn't it the Mo Ibrahim Foundation tried to offer a huge prize for African leaders that retired and sorted out their succession, because nobody was, and therefore they thought, okay, if we offer them very large amounts of money so that they can retire successfully and wealthily and safely, maybe there'll be better sort of turnover of leaderships. And I think they've only managed to give their awards to about 4 individuals in a very long space of time. So I think that's a real problem. And I think most political leaders around the world, you know, have not achieved that position of leadership in the benign way that we're talking about. Most of them have had to fight their way to the top and probably kill lots of people, either physically or metaphorically, which just means they are definitely not going to be remotely interested in any rules about retirement and try and change them, as, you know, has happened recently, for example, in China.
Diane, do you think our attitudes to age in our leaders have changed because we are now more aware of the truth about what's going on? We can see President Biden falling down. We were more respectful, say, 30, 40 years ago, of their privacy.
Well, I think a lot has changed in the past 30 or 40 years that make that not straightforward to answer yes or no. Ruth gave the example of Greta Thunberg and the way that you need cohorts to change to bring about new kinds of values or priorities in leadership, which is a strong point. I mean, for me, given the work I do, one of the issues is technology, and the lack of understanding that older people have about technology when it's changing incredibly rapidly, as it has been and still is in digital and other scientific domains. There's a very excellent, well-known economist, Bob Gordon, who famously wrote a big book saying that one of the reasons productivity growth has slowed down is that all the technologies that we're inventing now are absolutely useless compared to the ones that were invented in the early 20th century. So if you think about indoor plumbing and electric lighting at home and the assembly line and so on, they were absolutely transformative technologies, but now he's saying everybody is just, you know, on social media and it's wasting time. And that's such a narrow view when you think about the whole range of technological innovations that are coming along. And I'm not thinking about chatbots, but all of the digitally enabled medical innovations and genetic technology, the potential for transforming energy to a zero carbon energy system, those would be big world-changing things that happen. And so if you then turn that spotlight on people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, my worry would be, can they evaluate policies around generative AI when all of these plausible young Silicon Valley dudes are coming along and saying, it's marvelous, it's going to increase growth and create jobs, and you might be addressing leaders who are still printing out their emails and don't really have any basis on which to evaluate that kind of claim.
So you're saying they might be too credulous, not that they just didn't understand it, but they were too easily taken in.
If you've got experience of early 20th century technologies or mid-20th century technologies, that experience doesn't help you. That
surely, Paul, in the age of AI, every organisation now being told they've got to confront what AI means, would militate against having older leaders, particularly in business. I'm still puzzled by this idea that business leaders are getting older.
Well, you're exactly right, that we may want to say that the cost of having an older leader in place at a time when technology is changing particularly fast may be higher than it was 10 or 20 years ago, and that should be a reason why we should evaluate the characteristics of leaders, including their age, with a slightly different set of criteria than we used to. But in a sense, I think we're drifting away from the topic of the question, which is not are older leaders better or worse, but should we have a retirement age? Because a retirement age is a way of saying, regardless of how good we think they are, they should go after a certain point. And so I think the question isn't really, do we think they're getting better? Because as democratic citizens or as people involved in choosing leaders in business, we can make that decision. We can be swayed by these arguments. The whole point, and it's a rather counterintuitive point about having a retirement age, is it says, no, when the leader has reached a certain point, we should no longer be trying to make that judgment. And I think that if we weren't worried about the outlier cases, the disaster cases, there would be no case for a compulsory retirement age, because we'd just say, sure, there are good arguments why in this current world we should be mostly electing younger leaders. It's precisely the fact that we're worried about the disaster cases and we're worried about older leaders becoming entrenched when, even though we might want to get rid of them, we can't, that I think the arguments for a compulsory retirement age become strong.
And when you think about, for instance, the United States, where you can't serve more than 2 terms as president,
yes.
I mean, that's quite a powerful curb on overweening ambition. And would a retirement age do something similar?
Well, I mean, what we've seen is that having term limits, which are still in force in the United States, even though they've been circumvented in both Russia and China, are no doubt a good thing. I would entirely support them. And indeed, I think that whenever a leader proposes to change the rules to circumvent term limits, that should be in itself a warning signal. But what we've also seen is that having term limits doesn't stop us having very old leaders. So I think the case for term limits and the case for older leaders are both strong, but they're separate. And term limits don't solve the problem of older leaders.
So I feel the need to argue with Paul here.
Oh, good.
So I think there's a principle of not discriminating on the basis of personal characteristics. And so I would be focusing our attention, I mean, term limits are great, but I would focus our attention on reducing the voting age in political context, actually, because if you want to respond to the concerns of younger generations, and any of us who are in universities will know that they are very different for younger cohorts, would be, I think, in favour of reducing the voting age to 16. And actually, the older I've got, the more powerful I think this argument has been.
Well, I love it when Diane argues with me, but it doesn't make me want to argue with her. I actually agree with you about lowering the voting age. And I would even be prepared to be talked into not having a retirement age if you can give me an alternative set of mechanisms that might help us deal with these outlier cases, like an older leader whose judgment has really gone but whose skills seem to be at least somewhat okay. Now, you said something which I think is very interesting we might want to delve into. Would you say maybe we can do measuring better than we used to? I mean, after all, we're now all of us wearing intrusive surveillance technology on our wrists, and it may be that actually it's possible to put in place mechanisms for telling us things about what our leaders are doing that massively bypasses or depasses.
So you can be as old as you like, but we're going to watch your every step, and if you fall below certain measures, you're out.
Well, that's a possibility, but it was Diane who brought it up, so I'd be interested to know what she had in mind.
But I mean, can I just interrupt? Paul, I don't think people are voting for like Trump or Biden on the basis of their competence.
That's an extraordinary statement.
No, I mean, isn't that... I wouldn't think it was extraordinary at all. I mean, they have decided that they represent a whole kind of identity or pack of views. They're not under any illusion that... I honestly don't believe they're voting for individuals here. I think they're voting for ideas. But, I mean, maybe you're the political... I'm not a political scientist, but that's the way it looks to me.
So I wonder if we should be talking not about the individual so much, and we are falling for this myth of the heroic leader who's in charge. And obviously you get that in a presidential system, but actually it's the leadership team that matters more. You would hope that in a democratic environment, the leader, the person elected to be president or prime minister, does have an eye to the variety of experience and knowledge on their team and can appoint people who compensate for their inadequacies. Now, I have to say, I'm not sure this has happened in any of the countries that you might be thinking about at the moment. But ideally, you would want the Lincoln team of rivals structure for effective leadership of a country.
Yes, but come on, Diane. I am now going to argue with you. You goaded me beyond endurance. I mean, when a US president comes in, obviously he or she is entitled to choose their team. He or she is not entitled suddenly to fire all of the people in the line of command manning the nuclear missiles. There is a very well-established protocol that ensures that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that these things are not fired by accident and so on. And there's a whole series of things which in some sense are overlooked by the US Constitution, but which are embodied in day-to-day sense in a very large number of protocols that constrain the things that a leader can do. And what I'm suggesting is that thinking about what might happen to an older leader who's losing it belongs in that family of protocols. Now, how we should insert it in there, whether the way to insert it is through a compulsory retirement age or whether there are other ways of implementing those protocols, is, I think, entirely up for argument and very interesting thing to think about. But just simply saying, well, actually, if the leader comes in and says on day one in the Oval Office, I'm going to say, for example, that whether we launch a nuclear strike on Russia is going to be decided by popular vote of, the Iowa primary. I think, the deep state, it would be said, is going to prevent that, and thank goodness.
Okay, then, let me put a proposal. We're going to make 70 the compulsory retirement age for leaders across politics, business, and the universities. What's the downside? Diane?
That you get rid of some very good people, and that it breaches principles of non-discrimination on the grounds of personal characteristics.
We could still keep them in lower level positions. They just couldn't be leaders.
Yes, I was going to say, I mean, you say get rid of. I find this rather sinister. What is going on in Cambridge these days? I mean, this smacks of Sweeney Todd. I mean, they just disappear under into the cellar in Churchill College and are never seen again? No, I mean, they don't disappear.
So, Ruth,
they just no longer have their finger on the nuclear button.
Ruth, you sat here looking like you're at a tennis match between these two, ping-ponging it back and forth.
But 70 is too old. That's the downside of that. It should be much earlier.
You want a compulsory retirement age much earlier than 70?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about leaders, yes. You can't, I think a lot of the younger generation think they're never going to retire because of the change in the financial circumstance. So I don't think you can make compulsory retirement ages. But when you're talking about people who have presumably got plenty of money, then maybe you do have that option. I just quickly want to say, I had a very quick look to see if there were any anthropological examples of compulsory retirement ages, and the only one I could find was pre-war Japanese households where at 60, the father is meant to pass on the running of the household to his son. And I think that probably works because it's a relative, so there's no conflict of interest there. He's still living in the household, he's not really giving up a lot, still got somewhere to live, and he probably wants to pass his house on to his son anyway. And so that works pretty well. And actually, I've lived in the Far East a little bit, and the age of 60 is considered an important age where you've kind of done your stuff and it's time to pass on to others. Having said that, I'm over 60 and I'm not retiring, so I know I'm a hypocrite, but that's why you have to kick me out.
Let's. I think we're drawing to a conclusion here, and I'm going to ask If not compulsory retirement, what else? What else can we do to ensure a regular turnover in leadership while preserving valuable knowledge and expertise? Paul?
Well, I do support a compulsory retirement age, and I actually would like it to be quite young. And I think it's precisely because we tend to think of retirement as the end that we haven't thought creatively enough about how to use the wisdom and expertise and experience of older people in society. But I think that if you are going to ask people to be taking some critical decisions like the ability to launch wars, then you really want to put some very strict criteria in place for who has the right to do that. I mean, even the fact that somebody might launch a war at the age of 82, which would cut a year or two off that person's life expectancy, but cut decades or more off the life expectancy of the rest of the citizens, seems to me a fundamental breach in the social contract. So I'm actually sticking for a compulsory retirement age. But if we can't have it, I'd go with much, much closer medical monitoring of society's leaders, and obviously not have that displayed on the internet in real time, but to ensure that there's a group of people with a very strict set of rules and a mandate to monitor that information. So I think that would be a plan B, but it's a pretty inadequate plan B compared with my preferred plan A.
Ruth, which plan are you for? Compulsory retirement or something else?
For leaders, well, I'm just going to give a very anthropological answer, which is just all about power structures. So if anthropologists don't like saying should, because they it's all relative. But I think it would be a good idea, but I don't know how you'd enforce it. You'd have to have a lot of fights with a lot of powerful people, and that's the cost you'd have to put into your decision making.
Diane, you seem to be against.
I'm against it. I don't want 25-year-old men with their finger on the nuclear button either, and on balance I think they're probably more likely to start it. We've got an ageing population. Compulsory retirement is just not going to happen, so let's not waste time on something impractical. I think the things to go for are term limits where they don't exist, and a significant reduction in the voting age so that younger people at least have more influence over who becomes the leader.
Well, that's a fascinating note on which to end. We did have one episode of Crossing Channels in which somebody advocated that children aged 6 should be given the vote. So radical ideas always from this podcast. That's all we've got time for, as I said. Thanks to Diane Coyle from the Bennett Institute and Ruth Mace and Paul Seabright from the IAST. This episode, recorded in front of a live audience at the Institut Français in London, is the final edition of Season 3 of Crossing Channels. We'll be back in October with a fourth series, when I will actually be a keen listener, as this is my last episode presenting Crossing Channels.
Yes, I really want to say at this point that there's a very large number of people that I would like to nominate for instant retirement, and Rory Cellan-Jones is not one of them. I mean, what I'd really like to say is that I think we owe him a lot. I mean, when 3 years ago, it was proposed that Rory Cellan-Jones be the host of this. You know, some of us worried whether this relatively green and inexperienced reporter, who'd worked for a few minor organisations like the BBC, was up to the exposure and the pressure and, the fantastic public outreach of the Crossing Channels podcast. But I must say, he's grown in the job. But we owe him a great deal, and I think we would like to thank him in our own way.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to the audience, and thank you everyone for tuning in to this series of Crossing Channels. Stay tuned for Series 4, where we'll continue to investigate many more policy challenges. Thank you.